Well, good morning. Welcome to our Through the Bible in a Year video series. I don't remember getting a video out last week, and I apologize for that. It was a bit of a crazy Monday, and by the time I got to thinking about a video, it was pretty late in the week, and I just decided against it. I hope that doesn't offend too many people. This week we are in the book of Joshua, and there are several themes that I want to look at, or at least several things that I noticed throughout the book, the early chapters of the book. The first is obviously I want to highlight in Joshua kind of this including the outsiders motif. It's very easy for us as we read the book to get caught up in the violence and this kind of outsider roles, and Joshua destroying the cities and the people, just pushing out the indigenous people, as we would say in our modern language. But throughout the book, there's this underlying tone of Rahab being accepted, of the foreigners who are with Joshua participating in circumcision and some of the other rites as full members of the community. There is this there's this motif in the book that all it really takes to join Israel is a willingness to join with God and to see what God is doing in the world. The nature of Rahab is that as long as she was willing to see God and commit to Israel's God, she was allowed to join the camp. She was allowed to join the group, and she was allowed to live with them and share with them. I think that is an underappreciated aspect of the book in much of our modern world, where we do tend to focus in on the violence and on the conquest and on pushing out people. There is this notion of part of what Israel is supposed to be doing is getting the foreigners to embrace who God is. And at their best, they are helping the people on the outside to embrace who God is and what God is doing. The other major theme that I want to kind of look at a little bit is the theme of holiness. It starts out early on where Joshua encounters the commander of the Lord's armies. This military figure, we would call him an angel, but we see this military figure show up into Joshua's life, and his command to him was, take off your shoes, take off your sandals, because you're standing on holy ground. This notion that as the people enter the land itself is holy. It is separate. It is sacred. And what they need to do is not just rid the land of idolatry and the pollution of the outsiders. They have to be worthy of entering the land. Joshua himself has to take off his shoes. The first things they do on entering the land are celebrate the Passover and circumcise the children. Well, the men. All of the men. In other words, they commit themselves to the ordinances, the outward symbols of what makes the people separate. The land itself, the commander of the Lord's army shows that the land itself is holy. It is separate for God. And so the people of God, in order to positively enter the land, in order to enter the land as an appropriate possessor, they have to commit themselves to being the kind of people worthy of possessing the land. That is, I think, important for us today, especially as we, in the news, we hear about the nature of what it's like to be an American. You know, I try not to get too far into those debates, but one of the things that I know is true is that if we want to inherit the world as Christians, the world that God is giving us, if we claim that we are the rightful governors or possessors of the world as Christians, it's not because God owns it and we can take it however we want. We are rightful heirs to that promise only as far as we commit ourselves to the holiness that is necessary to taking possession. In other words, if we are not worthy, if we are not living up to God's ideals and when we possess the land, then we don't have a rightful claim to it. And so, considering how Jesus lived and acted, if we don't live like Jesus, we don't have a right to call ourselves Christians. If we don't live out the kind of love that Jesus showed, we don't have a right to call ourselves Christians, and therefore we don't have a right to inherit the land. And that's kind of one of the themes that we should be looking at as we see Joshua, as we go through Joshua. What does it mean to be the people of God? What does it mean to have a rightful claim to the land? What does it mean to have a rightful claim to what God wants to give us? And what do we have to do to be in the right? Because what we see in Joshua in the early chapters is after they conquer Jericho, Achan decides he's going to live in a lifestyle other than what God calls him to. And he is dispossessed in the most brutal way possible. He is not given a place in God's kingdom because he decides he's not going to live by God's decrees. That should be a wake-up call to us. One of the realities of the book of Joshua is we get focused in on the violence, we get focused in on the conquest, and we like to think we're the good guys conquering the bad guys. The reality is we need to take the lessons from Achan. Don't be the person unworthy of the conquest. And then if you are a person worthy of the conquest, trust God to give it to you. Don't just assume like they did, like the people of Israel did coming out of the Battle of Jericho. They assumed that they could win handily without God. They were part of God's people. And they go to conquer this little town of Ai. And they're soundly defeated. Because they just assumed they were part of God's people. And stopped caring about that holiness. And so they became treated just like the people that they were supposed to dispossess. That should be the wake-up call for us. We should be the ones who look at Achan and say, am I Achan? Am I worthy of taking possession of what God wants to give me or not? And I shouldn't be too fixated on what the rest of the world is doing. That's what I get from these early chapters of Joshua. Maybe I'll try to get a couple other videos out this week just to kind of apologize for not doing one last week. But anyway, until we meet again, God bless.